thank you everybody for being here. First and foremost, please if everyone could take a moment right now and just turn their phones on to silent or vibrate, just double check, so that we can make good use of the time. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for the event. I am part of a group called the Society of Neuroscience Graduate Students. We newly formed about a year ago, and we had the idea of putting on this event and went forth to make it happen. And in order to make it happen, we need some funders and support, and so we reached out to the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, who has helped put on this event, and also the Brain and Mind Institute helped us put on this event as well, and the Society of Graduate Students put on this event. So it's kind of just like the neuroscience program is interdisciplinary, so is this event sponsorship. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce our moderator for tonight, which is a professor from the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, Anthony Skelton, and here he is.
Okay, so thanks so much for that. So welcome everybody. As already said, I'm Anthony Skelton, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at Western. I did smoke cannabis in the 90s, but I didn't inhale. So there were no dangerous effects occurred to me at that point. But this might not be the case for many others who will smoke marijuana after October the 17th, when cannabis becomes legal in Canada. And so we have good reason, given that social experiment that we're going to embark on, and some of the things that we will do as a consequence of that, to think about what the implications are of that social change and how we might try to best handle it, whether we're thinking about it from a scientific point of view, or a philosophical or ethical point of view, or political or legal point of view. So what we've done this evening is assemble an esteemed panel, or a panel of esteemed people, to help us clarify and think about and determine the implications of legalized recreational cannabis use. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask each individual to introduce him or herself, and then we'll turn over to some questions and hope that we'll have a great and interesting conversation, which, given the people that are here, I'm sure will be the case. And then after we've concluded our panel discussion, we're going to have some opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. I'm sure you'll all have some questions. I know I have lots of questions myself. So I'll start on my far right here. Terence, introduce yourself first, please.
Thank you. My name is Terence Kernaghan. I'm currently the NDP MPP for London North Centre. I am the LGBTQ critic for Her Majesty's official opposition. So I'm off busy at Toronto. I had to rush here. Managed to get here in decent time. I'm so thankful. I was a little bit worried that I was racing against the clock. So thank you all for coming. I look forward to our conversation this evening.
Okay. My name is Jonas Vanderzwan. I'm a family doctor. I'm a GP, and I have been for about 15 years. The last 3 or 4 years of which I've been operating at least part-time in the cannabis space, doing patients' assessments and prescribing cannabis for a variety of medical conditions. I've also recently taken on the role of medical director of a local licensed producer of medical cannabis, WeedMD. My role with them is predominantly one of education and medical outreach. We've got this prior to this experiment that we're about to embark on October 17th, we've had quite a lengthy experiment of use of medical cannabis, and there are about 300,000 patients in this country who are currently using medical cannabis for a variety of purposes. And despite that fairly impressive volume of patients, the physician community still remains very uncomfortable with the use of cannabis. They have a lot of questions, and they are constantly being confronted by patients with these questions, and a lot of them are very unprepared in terms of dealing with those questions. So that's my main role as medical outreach, trying to get physicians comfortable.
Okay, Jibran.
My name is Jibran Khokhar. I am an assistant professor at the University of Guelph. I've just started my academic career as a scientist there. I'm a pharmacologist by training who is currently interested in the lab in the chicken or egg question of schizophrenia and substance use, cannabis use being one of them, and trying to figure out whether it's schizophrenia that causes the cannabis use or cannabis use that causes the schizophrenia. And we're using a variety of approaches in the lab to study that. In addition to that, we're also really interested in the effects of
cannabis exposure on the developing brain and the long-term consequences of that as you develop and as the brain develops, and that looking at the especially vulnerable period of adolescence. So hope to contribute some of that to the discussion today. Thank you for being here.
I'm Ruth Ross. I'm chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at University of Toronto. I'm a pharmacologist, and I've been working on the molecular pharmacology of cannabinoids for probably about 25 years. So working on the pharmacology of THC, CBD, and also the endocannabinoid system, how that works in physiology and pathophysiology. So I've got a variety of research interests in both the potential therapeutic elements of cannabis, but also some of the potential harmful effects of cannabis, potentially recreationally or in different contexts.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm going to try to sort of set the stage for our discussion by asking some questions about what the policy situation is going to look like, both in general in Canada on October the 17th and also in particular in Ontario. And then I'm going to ask some questions about some of the issues to do with the science, including the effects of cannabis use on the brain. And then maybe we can move from there to some conversations about some things to do with what we might think about what we ought to do in light of both the policy that we're going to have, but also the scientific evidence, the best scientific evidence that we have available to us. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with Terence. I know you've had a long trip here from Toronto, so I hate to start off with you, but maybe you could just, being a politician and being involved in the fabrication of policies and things like that, maybe you could just sort of give us some sense of sort of what the policy on the recreational use of cannabis looks like, or will look like on October the 17th. And obviously we have the federal legislation already in place. Maybe you could say a little bit about that. Maybe you could also say a little bit what you think. Obviously you don't know this concretely yet. What you think things will look like in Ontario. So things like what's sort of generally permitted for people to do with respect to recreational usage. What things are kind of prevented, and what you think some of the merits or demerits of this policy are. And maybe we can then ask people who want to add to that. Sounds great.
Well, under the previous government's plan, they had initially wanted to have a purely state-run Ontario dispensary service. So it was going to start off with about 40 stores, in which sort of run like the LCBO, in fact run through the LCBO. Now, with the change in government, they have decided that that plan is not going to work for them. So instead, on October the 17th, it will be an online service only, and the details of which are still a little bit hazy. Unfortunately, this government has not been giving the greatest indication of what their plan is and where they're going. So there is some legislation that will be tabled tomorrow. Now, some things that are interesting in terms of what has happened is that on July the 1st, there was supposed to be legislation to take effect surrounding the use of vaping or inhaling devices. And it was meant to make sure that people around children in confined spaces would not be able to use nicotine inhalers. Now, this government decided to scupper that legislation. And as a result, there is now no legislation surrounding the inhalation of cannabinoids. So it's one of these very legal gray areas, which is kind of troubling. So people will effectively have access to these, and there is no legislation indicating where they can and cannot do it. Myself, I am in favor of the idea that the LCBO or the Ontario Cannabis Store would be regulating or controlling the sale and purchases of cannabis. When you look at it, the LCBO already has trained staff. They already have things like SmartServe. They're already used to handling intoxicants. However, when we look at the way the government has started to treat this, they're almost equating cannabis with cigarettes, and those two things are vastly different. So it raises, certain questions. Can you smoke a joint in your car? Unfortunately, there's no legislation against that now. While there will be legislation for people with impaired driving, it's something that's quite strange. And just a few days ago in the news, the Premier was quizzed about his policies regarding the public consumption of cannabis. And he said, well, it's not going to be allowed on playgrounds or in parks. And when pressed, he had to eventually admit that it is indeed allowed in parks. But then he sort of backpedaled and said, well, it should be only allowed in big parks. Which is questionable because, where is this sort of bar for a big park, small park? I don't know the answer to that question. However, as it stands right now, it will be treated in the same way as cigarettes are in public spaces. It will have to be 20 meters from children's play areas and away from children. But generally speaking, in a park, it is permissible. And there are so many other little wrinkles that are going into this. It is sort of 2 steps ahead the government has taken by jumping directly into legalization rather than decriminalization. And it's, unfortunately, it has created all sorts of little different scenarios that have not been really thought out and not been planned. And it's the onus will be upon the government as well as, the wider community to make sure you're speaking your concerns and so that decent legislation can be formed that, keeps people safe and protects people. Not only just those people who consume cannabis, but those people who also want to live in a safe and free society.
Okay, thanks so much, Terence. So maybe I'll ask this a sort of follow-up question, maybe for Jonas. So we spoke about this before at lunch, but maybe I'll bring it up here. So one of the reasons that the Trudeau government gave for wanting to legalize the recreational use of cannabis, Canada is the second country to do so after Uruguay, is that it would make it harder for particular young people to obtain cannabis, whatever variety. I wonder, Jonas, you're a medical doctor and you're involved in the marketing of recreational cannabis. Do you think it's right to think that this sort of more permissive policy on cannabis is going to make it harder for young people to obtain cannabis? Do you worry about that kind of thing?
Yeah, I guess anything I say here is speculation. Now, we do have other jurisdictions who have sort of gone this route. We do have Colorado as an experience that we can learn from. I think a lot of the concerns that we have around cannabis exposure by our young people perhaps may be overblown. We are one of the largest consumers of recreational cannabis by young people in the world already, despite years of well-established prohibition. And so I think a lot of those concerns are based on 2 premises, one of which being that the removal of that prohibition is automatically going to result in an increase in use by young people. If you look at the data in Colorado, and again, I haven't done a ton of research on this, but there seems to be an indication that that is actually not probably the case. Youth consumption has stayed fairly stable, perhaps maybe even a little bit of a mild downtick, but again, we're early in the experiment. So I think we need to be cautious with our fears, but I think it is a sort of an important thing to focus on. But again, I think time will tell, and Terence brings up a good point. With regards to the introduction of the adult use market, I think maybe we have, in some respects, sort of put the cart before the horse, and maybe we don't have everything as ironed out as I think we probably should have. So this is clearly going to be legislation that's in evolution for a fairly lengthy period of time, I would presume.
Did either of you want to?
I'll comment on that, the Colorado thing, and after lunch I went back. Colorado was sort of like Canada, but maybe some parts of Canada that have more usage than others. And so what's interesting is, yes, the rates in Colorado haven't gone up in the adolescents, but if you look across the US and compare states that have medical marijuana or legalized marijuana laws compared to states that don't, the states that have the laws have higher usage in adolescents compared to the states that don't. So there is that at a level of whether it's legalized or medicinally available or not, that we might see happen here. Colorado was sort of ahead of the curve already, that maybe that's why we didn't see an uptake, but it'll be an interesting experiment at a national stage to see what happens to the rates as we go forward.
Yeah, we've talked lots about adolescence, and we kind of often talk about the words youth, young adults, adolescents, when it all kind of gets bundled up together. And there's clearly lots of kind of concern around young adults. You don't suddenly become your physiology is still developing after the age of 18, for example, or 19. Even in terms of brain development, we think almost like 25, 26 are still really important stages. So I think becoming so really focused on we're keeping this out of the hands of youth is a kind of confusing messaging, because certainly one of the concerns around will there be increased use is around the fact that the task force on cannabis clearly stated the guidelines against promotions and marketing and so on, and that's really very obviously already kind of sliding. There's lots of promotions and marketing already happening, and that may well lead, the goal of that clearly is to increase use or to promote use, and that is legal use potentially in the big market, which is young adults. So that's a whole major area of concern, is promotion, marketing, increased use in a potentially vulnerable population in terms of brain development.
If I can maybe follow up on that too, it highlights a good point. So, from a medical perspective, both the CMA and the OMA are really initially quite taken aback by the fact that it's going to be permitted by 19-year-olds. If we had our druthers, would have had a restriction in age at 25. That seems to be where most of the research would indicate a level of risk in individuals below the age of 25. I think for a variety of reasons, this is clearly, there's a lot of sort of components to this rationale, but that age reduction is something that the physician community is a little bit not that impressed by at this point.
Right, so it is important just to emphasize that in Ontario, the age at which you can purchase it legally is 19 at the present moment. That's the other.
Yeah.
You can have up to 30 grams and 4 plants for your own consumption. Okay, just so people know what they can do after the 17th. Myself included.
I see everyone writing things down.
They're gotta get the facts out. Maybe just I just want to follow up on something. So one of the ways in which we figure out whether we're on the right track in terms of the kind of policies we want, we look at other jurisdictions that have taken similar policy steps and see what the outcomes are. So if it is true that legalization will help to keep younger people and youth less likely to consume. So one more question I have for the people who use the example of Colorado was, imagine it was the case that it just was true that adolescents or young people, did consume less marijuana as a consequence of legalization. Would that mean they just no longer consumed it, or that they chose some other illegal substance? And is that something that we should worry about? So there's maybe reasons why people are consuming cannabis recreationally, maybe because it's illegal, or things that might be getting. We could speak to that possibility, whether that's something we should think about.
Well, I come at this also as an educator. I was an elementary school educator, and I could not tell you how shocked I was when I learned that the youth were also vaping. They were borrowing their parents' inhalers, and it just seemed so odd to me. But I guess it only makes sense that the forbidden fruit is always something that kids will go for. If it's something that they're told they're not supposed to do, they will do it anyways. So there is some merit to the thought that if it does become legal, it does become conventional, then maybe it won't be quite as much of a draw. And also, I've got to say, in collaborating with a couple of my teacher colleagues, it was really quite awkward within the last couple of years in talking about substance use and abuse in the curricula, because here we are as educators saying, drugs are bad, drugs are wrong, don't do this, but in a couple of years, cannabis will be legal. So we were delivering an outdated curriculum. knowingly doing so, but also saying this is going to be coming into effect. So it was a very strange position to be in.
I can go. Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at sort of the whole concept of cannabis availability to the general population, I think it's important to look at it from a population health standpoint. And what you're referring to is sort of the substitution effect. And we see the substitution effect with cannabis with other things, but in the other direction, right? So we know in some of these jurisdictions that when given access to cannabis on a regular basis through a recreational adult use market, alcohol, as an example, the purchase of alcohol decreased by a significant percentage. We're starting to see people in the community, when they're given access to medical cannabis, there are significant dose reductions in opioid consumption for pain management. So there are people in the community currently that are self-medicating with recreational cannabis, and perhaps when given access through a legal means, they will continue to use it, perhaps in maybe more quantities, and could result in some of these other sort of unexpected benefits. So something to think about.
So one thing that has happened in places like Colorado is the increased availability of cannabis has resulted in the availability of potentially more harmful forms of cannabis. And so you have seen the increases in things like dabbing, or the availability of what's called shattered glass, and I hope it never makes it to Canada, but it probably will. It's 98% crystallized THC, where you break it and put it on a hot plate and inhale what's left. And so it'll be interesting to see how that landscape changes. Right now in Canada, we're going to have edibles are going to be legal at least until a year after, and that whole landscape will also be interesting too, because that's a whole other can of worms. And going back to the vaping thing that you were mentioning, so one thing at the epidemiological level that we're seeing, at least in the last few years, is this downtick of substance use in general in this emerging population, or this adolescent population. And it's because kids these days view themselves, they're more woke. And so there has been this downtick in overall use, but there are emerging trends, one of them being vaping. And in fact, in some parts of North America, juuling, as it's called, which are JUULS, they're a type of e-cigarettes. It's almost an epidemic in high schools, and because of the supposed harm reduction, or that they're not as bad for you as cigarettes, so because they're more health conscious, they're now turning to these e-cigarettes. So that's going to be the interesting undertone, that depending on how medical marijuana or marijuana in general gets marketed to the people. If it's marketed as the natural health product and the panacea that sometimes it's made up to be, then we'll see a very different uptake compared to the drug that has harmful effects. And we're a far ways away from the reefer madness storyline that was around back in the 70s, but still we'll really need to temper its potential health benefits, which in my opinion, there aren't many. We're still gaining more information on that versus the potential harmful effects. And depending on how that is perceived by the public, we'll see differences in uptake.
Okay, I have just a question for you. So in your preamble, you talked a little bit about THC, CBD. So I know a little bit about those. Maybe you could just sort of just give us some sense of what those are. That cannabis, I guess, in the right thing, cannabis possesses those characteristics or those elements, and just sort of what is sort of attractive about them for someone who want to consume them.
Okay. Well, everyone's so well versed in THC and CBD now because of the interest in cannabis. It's interesting for me, having been in this game for a long time. When I used to give my PhD talks, and conferences, and it was always the last talk on the last day of the conference, and everyone left because no one was interested in cannabis or cannabinoids, because it was kind of, so it's interesting now to have stayed the course in this for so long, and now everyone knows what THC is. As I'm sure you all know, THC is we refer to it as the psychoactive component of cannabis, and CBD is the other major constituent of cannabis. So cannabis contains about 60 different cannabinoids, but these are the two major players, but we're always discovering new things about the other minor cannabinoids, as we call them. THC is the really responsible for lots of the effects. It's responsible for causing the high. It's also responsible for potentially causing the acute psychosis that people can experience if they take a high dose of THC. So it's maybe responsible for some of the increased risk around schizophrenia. THC is also responsible for the pain relief that people experience with cannabis. CBD, really, there's a lot of hype about CBD. People talk about it a lot, and really the reality is we have very little solid evidence on CBD. It's not psychoactive. We've got one good clinical trial showing that it's effective in one form of childhood epilepsy. And that's it in terms of evidence. So we, as with THC, in terms of double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials to work out exactly what's going on, we really have very little data. CBD is, we don't have a molecular target. So any of you who know anything about pharmacology, we know how THC works. We know its receptor targets in the brain, we know what it does and how it interacts with the endocannabinoid system. For CBD, we don't know. So there's so much we don't know, and I think it's really important going forward as we look at all sorts of websites and all sorts of information that's coming from lots of sources. There's a lot of things said about both THC and CBD that are not backed by any of the type of evidence that I would consider scientifically robust evidence or data.
So we've got a substance that we're legalizing, but that we don't have a lot of hard evidence regarding its effects.
We've got evidence of the effects, but when you think of the facts, so the example I use with the students is, so if we come up with a new drug that's effective for anxiety, we would do lots of trials, and we'd say, well, say 5 milligrams a day is going to be, we've done a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, and we know that 1 milligram or 5 milligrams is safe and effective. Now, what we wouldn't then say is, oh, well, try 50 milligrams, you'll be fine. You know, we just wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do that without data, and B, we would never use a higher dose without knowing whether that was safe and effective. And the fact is now we've got a whole plethora of percentages of THCs, ratios of THC and CBD. Often the data on safety that's coming, so people will say, well, we've got 30 years of epidemiology, but those 30 years are based on what people were using in the 60s, which was 5% THC and 5% CBD, completely different from maybe 20-25% THC, or even 50-60% in the kind of edibles. So we have no really, the kind of data that I as a pharmacologist would think is credible. We've really got very little of that.
Okay, great. So maybe you can speak to this, Jonas. So what from your point of view as a researcher on these issues, where do you think are some of the holes in the science that you think we ought to try to fill as we're kind of thinking how to navigate this new policy environment?
Yeah, so there has never been a better time to be a cannabis researcher than right now.
So it's high times.
But it's a great time to be in this field, but also a bad time because people are coming out of the woodworks trying to jump onto this bandwagon without much of the foundational knowledge that we need. And every licensed provider out there is starting a clinical trial of their own for their favorite disease, which their uncle said that they tried cannabis for and it worked, and that must be the reason. And so lots of money. It's going to be a big money game, right? So there's, I think, $22 billion industry by 2020 or something like that in Canada. So it's so where there's money, people do come out of the woodworks. But I think in terms of the needs, there are, I would go 3 different places. One of them is at a basic science, foundational, fundamental level, where we need to understand what the different routes of administration, be it oral versus inhaled, baked versus burnt, edible versus shattered glass, in a young person versus an old person, in a male versus a female. All of those things are not known. When we do these studies in animals, we just decide on a dose and give it to the animal, and that's how it's been done. And every paper out there has used a different dose, different method of delivery, and so there's no systematic way of comparing across studies. So that's something that we need fundamentally right now, is to sort of harmonize across the work that's done both in humans and in animals, to really figure out the pharmacokinetic parameters under which a lot of these drugs are acting. The second place that we really need is a way to harmonize that at the level of the point of sale, and especially once this becomes privatized, who knows what's in yours? So somebody could tell you this is 5% THC and 10% CBD, and we don't really have a centralized way of confirming that or ensuring that. And, we need like a Health Canada style lab that tests everything from your purple kush to whatever else is out there in terms of strains, because they're so different. And you have practitioners and dispensaries that have, this is the anxiety strain, and this is the PTSD strain, and this is the schizophrenia strain, without knowing what's exactly in them. And usually these strains, for the most part, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the names and the different strains are usually based on not even their THC CBD profile, they're based on their terpene profile, because that's what dictates what they smell and taste and the mouthfeel and all of that feels like. So we really need science on that front. And then the last place would be strong epidemiological research that really looks at the consequences of this use. One of the great things we'll have, because we have legalization in Canada, is that people are going to be more willing to report adverse events. You didn't want to get caught with a busted tail light because you also had marijuana in your pocket, or you didn't go to the hospital because you had cannabis-induced hyperemesis, and so which is hyperemesis is excessive vomiting as a result of cannabis intake, and so all of those things you would not report, or especially because you didn't want to tell your parents about it. So we'll have the ability to have more data than we've ever had before in a country where this is legalized, and so that's what we need is more data, and that's part of the reason why we don't have good data from the US or from other places, is because even though it's been legal in Colorado at the federal level, it's been illegal, and so this is really so we'll have a unique ability to really assess what the long-term consequences. And we're in the middle of a real-life epidemiological, social experiment that we will be able to see what happens in the next 10 to 15 years.
Jonas, you're on the sort of you're the medical practice, you're on the scientific side, but you're also in the sort of sales side of things. Is there some aspect of the science that you think is overlooked here, or do you agree with that in terms of sort of things that we need to study for the purpose of better marketing, for example, or better sale, or better...
Yeah, I try and stick to my lane, and that is as a medical professional. So in terms of marketing, I leave that to the other individuals. I guess what I would say in response is, when it comes to quality control and knowing what we've got and how much THC and how much CBD, this is a system that will allow us, hopefully, to be better with regards to that. As it stands now, there are multiple dispensaries. Go to downtown Vancouver, you could probably walk into 100 at any point of day. And you're absolutely right, you have absolutely no idea what you're getting. They can advertise whatever they like, and there's no quality control. With the system as it's proposed, all cannabis is going to be supplied by Health Canada, federally regulated, licensed producers that have intense quality control programs, and what they advertise you're getting is exactly what you're getting. So I think in that respect, it is a step forward, and it's a step forward also from a safety standpoint. They are definitely looked at closely for herbicides and pesticides as contaminants, which the current dispensary model does not address. Now, the question is, does a well-regulated federal program eliminate illegal dispensaries? That's a bigger question. And I think, again, time will tell. I think over time, again, speculation, you're going to see a decrease, but time will tell.
So maybe I'll just, should we want to something?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you take a look at the legislative changes that are surrounding this. Currently, there are 8 cannabis-related offenses. They include things like trafficking, possession, importing, exporting, that sort of thing. But under the new legislation that is coming into effect, there will be 45 offenses. So while we think that this is going to be this freewheeling, amazing time, and perhaps in some ways it will be, it is actually a crackdown on dispensaries. The fines right now, or once this comes into effect on October 17th, it will be punishable of up to 14, or if you sell cannabis without a license, you can go to jail for up to 14 years and up to $1 million in fines. So it really is an interesting legislative change. It is a way of the government sort of taking control of this, but also really cracking down on these sort of independent shops that have popped up. What is also fascinating too is that the Ontario government is only talking about having 12 suppliers for cannabis. Now, in places like Colorado, for instance, they have about 500. Now, what that allows is to allow those strict standards, so that if a supplier isn't adhering to certain standards in terms of, pesticides, herbicides, and all that sort of thing, well, then they'll be dropped and they won't be able to sell their product. So what this is creating is it's an interesting scenario here in Ontario. I just want to add that.
So, do you want to ask me?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because you know about these 45 categories. So one of from a societal perspective, one of the reasons I agree with legalization, and support it is because of the social inequity side of it. The people of color, those, for example, or marginalized communities otherwise are at a much greater risk for incarceration, or are incarcerated at a much higher rate compared to other communities. And so now that we have 45 different things, are they just going to be incarcerated for other things more so? Because our policing isn't necessarily going to change, and so they're still going to be stopped more for things. So I don't know if now, I didn't know that there's going to be 45 different criminal offenses. I don't know if things will actually improve on that side of things.
Well, I guess perhaps that comes back to your question about shattered glass. Maybe that will be something that would be deemed illicit. When you're allowed to grow 4 plants at home and have up to 30 grams, I can't fathom how people would really need illicit sources of cannabis when you can get it in a bricks and mortar store. You can order it online, you can grow it yourself, my goodness.
Marijuana does sometimes have a bad impact on your motivation.
I guess, point click, and there you go. But what, I really, the point you make about the inequity with cannabis legislation and the enforcement of it, it really does, the data is absolutely astonishing when you take a look at the number of, I was taking a look at data from 2003 to 2013 and the proportion of Toronto population who were black and were charged with simple possession, and as opposed to the proportion of white males who were charged. And it is absolutely, it's disgraceful. I'm going to take a look at one stat. For those people who are between the ages of 12 and 18, for those 10 years, 15% of black youth were detained for bail. Now, for white youth, 3.2%. This is their first offense, And for whatever reason, the black youth were kept. And this would go on the record. You think about the long-term impacts on their ability to get a loan, their ability to go to school, their ability to work. It's absolutely unconscionable. And just as a little side note on my research, you wouldn't believe how many police chiefs are now involved in the cannabis industry. Julian Fantino. He was London's former police chief and also in Toronto, and then Conservative MP, who at one time in 2015, I believe he said he was dead set against cannabis. He's now on the director of Alethea, a medical marijuana, sort of puts people in contact with that. But also there's Gary Goodyear, Raf Sukar, Kim Derry, and the ex-premier of Ontario, Ernie Eves, are all jumping into this industry. And so that I find rather fascinating.
So, Ruth, yes?
Just to kind of wrap up the whole thing, this thing to get in a second, you mentioned at the beginning, just you would have preferred, I think you maybe said you'd have preferred to see more of a kind of first step decriminalisation followed by legalisation, which is my view too. I'm not necessarily against legalisation per se, but I think number one, it's been really rushed, and number two, we could have gone for decriminalisation first, which would have covered obviously all the issues you're talking around in terms of inequity and so on. And the other point is this point of it's interesting. The fact that we've now got this only 12 identified licensed producers or whatever. So this is really, I mean, it's potentially going to be a follow-up question, but I would love if we did discuss it at some point. This model that we've come up with in Canada, which is really largely a for-profit, big cannabis, aka big tobacco type, big pharma type model, and there are many other models we could have chosen, which would have been a kind of decriminalisation, public health, not-for-profit model, which Canada chose not to do, which I think has been a major mistake.
So I mean, we could discuss that. I mean, so what are some of the possible rivals to the system that we've decided on? So you said decriminalisation, not-for-profit. So what would that look like? So are there jurisdictions in which that is the case, like the Netherlands, for example, or whatever it sort of benefits, to your mind? Yeah, so
my expertise is in molecular pharmacology, so there are other people who are probably more expert in policy than I am, but certainly from my understanding is Uruguay, for example, and Spain have gone for models that are not-for-profit, government-controlled, decriminalised. But the absolute focus is any income generated by the government is focused on public health. So a very strong public health message. And the problem with a for-profit model, which, as we all know, because we read it every day, is that this is a billion-dollar industry with a huge market. Now the market is not served, and the profits are not served by a strong public health message, which actually aim to potentially reduce the number of people with problematic cannabis use, which may be cannabis use disorder or some kind of mental health vulnerability. So the lessons we learned from big tobacco are that if you've got billions of dollars of profit, you've got a real barrier to a strong public health message that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with that. And particularly if your largest market, or in some ways your most important market, are young people, because they're going to be potentially lifelong users, and they're the people who use the product most, say between 19 and 30. So that's a real concern.
So it's just the idea that they're privatizing the profit but socializing the risk in this system?
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
I mean, as I say, I'm not a social scientist, so this is me kind of, there's lots of people who are experts in this kind of thing, but certainly from potentially in this, my answering of this is maybe from a perspective more of a layperson or a non-expert, but I would have thought a not-for-profit model with a strong public health focus would have been a way of decriminalisation, making much more safe availability, also strong ability for people to actually make choices around whether they want to take cannabis or not based on their assessment of the risk, just like you do with alcohol and tobacco. You know the risks and you choose to. Whereas that, you know, we knew that tobacco caused lung cancer in the 50s, and it's, you know, it's taken generations to get that.
So maybe both of you could say a little bit, and then we can pass over here a little bit about some of the public health threats then. So maybe this could be a good way to get into some of the, you know, thoughts you might have about, well, what are the effects of consumption of cannabis, you know, across the lifespan, so that we can sort of maybe better understand what the public health threats are, and then wonder whether that, you know, gives us evidence one way or the other for a different kind of model, like on the sort that you suggested Uruguay and Spain have accepted.
Yeah, so Jibran's also an expert on this, and I'd say the thing about public health messaging and so on this is that there's lots of things we actually don't know, as I said. So it may be that we get lots of great data, and actually the message is that this is potentially harmful to really a very small percentage of people, and they may be able to identify in some ways, and then that would be great. But the fact is that there's lots we actually don't know, and what we don't know can harm us. So from my perspective, cannabis use disorder is a thing. Dependence on cannabis. There are also certain groups of people who have a vulnerability to schizophrenia and psychosis or mental health disorders who may be at risk, and they don't know that now, you know, until it's revealed. And there may be a number of for example, people are now using cannabis for morning sickness, you know, for nausea during pregnancy, because it's natural, it might be safer than pharmaceutical. That probably isn't the case. So these are just some examples, but it's not a case of me saying, you know, this is going to make everyone sick. The fact is we just don't know yet, and that's my concern is what we don't know. We do know some real risks, lots of things we don't actually know yet. So
do you want to speak a little bit to some of the pharmacology?
Just quickly, so some places, one example of what has happened as a result of legalization is in Colorado, while there hasn't been an increase in use in adolescents, for example, there has been an increase in ER or emergency room or emergency department visits as a result of legalization. So that's two-sided. One side of it could be that they're using more dangerous or higher levels, or the other side is that because it's legalized now, they're willing to go to the doctor and to the hospital to get themselves looked at. So that's more at the acute level, where you have acute adverse reactions to cannabis, and they can range from acute psychosis, which is drug-induced, to hyperemesis, which is vomiting, to anywhere in between. You have people who get really high blood pressure as a result of THC or cannabis use, and you have others that get really low blood pressure as a result. So there's a lot of variability at the population level that masks a lot of the effects, because you have effects in both directions. Cannabis is a great drug for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, CINV. But it also by itself can cause vomiting. So there's that's why we don't have good data. That's why we don't know some of this. But then the other part of it is that it might disproportionately affect a certain percentage of the population that's already at greater risk for substance use. So people with serious mental illness use a lot of drugs. So, in fact, half of the cigarettes, not cannabis cigarettes, regular cigarettes, sold in North America are used by 5% of the population, and that's the 5% with serious mental illness. So 90% of patients with schizophrenia, for example, smoke regularly. And so it's that population with schizophrenia, with depression, with anxiety, with PTSD, that cannabis may actually affect in a negative way. So across the board, if you can get somebody who has PTSD or somebody who has schizophrenia to quit their cannabis use, you actually see an improvement in symptoms. And so this is some of the work that's been done at folks at CAMH in Toronto, that you see an improvement in depressive symptoms, you see an improvement in cognitive symptoms, you see an improvement in overall functioning. Cannabis is associated with a significant worsening of the course of these serious mental illnesses. So it's the population that was already vulnerable is now possibly even more vulnerable if the drug is more easier to access. And so that's where, and then it's also being polluted with the message that's being put out there that this is the wonder drug, this is the panacea, this is, if you have anxiety, so use some of this, and if you have this, use these drops. And I've had folks in my own family who have, seen the ads and they're like, oh, this is completely natural, CBD oil, and I have friends who ask me about this. So there's a lot of misinformation going around about this that may make the problem worse in some ways.
Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on the mental illness side of things, and I think that really is the big vulnerable population that we need to be cautious with. One of the sort of emerging demographics that I've certainly experienced in the medical side is the elderly and seniors population. These are individuals who are, when it comes to medical cannabis use, they are the population that are likely, or more likely, going to be living with some of the symptoms, chronic pain, anxiety, sleep disorders, that could potentially benefit from cannabis. And we're also operating in the context of a culture where there's a lot of backlash against some of the conventional medications that they've been forced to use over the decades. And they're looking for natural alternatives, and cannabis being one. And that brings into sort of the realm of needing to be cautious, other health conditions. They're also, unfortunately, the individuals that are living with other health conditions. They're on a multitude of medications. We need to be cautious with drug interactions. A lot of them may have unstable cardiac disease. We know that cannabis consumption, especially in a smoke form, can cause your heart rate to go up and become quite tachycardic. We could drop your blood pressure. They could be falling and breaking hips. So there's a lot of education that needs to go along with potential medical use, especially in that population.
And, when you take a look at the ways in which this can be treated in common society, let's think about what people will be able to do in their apartment. If you were in a system where it is shared among a number of people, is it okay for you to smoke copious amounts of marijuana inside a building when that air is shared with many other people? That seems highly unfair, and landlords will be able to enact a certain amount of legislation. I know that chances are they will also not want to allow people to cultivate their own plants. But then also, we have to consider this from a working, your life as having a job. Just because it's legal, does that mean you can show up to your job stoned? Well, in certain cases, if you are responsible for, let's say, heavy equipment or machinery, or responsible for children, you could get in a great deal of trouble with your employer. There was a recent case in which the employer, despite this individual who required medical cannabis to treat chronic pain, etc., I can't remember what the precise diagnosis was, they were able to actually take this person out of their job because that person was operating heavy machinery. Now the physician had said, well, this is medically required for this individual, but the employer was able to say, there's no barometer for how intoxicated someone is with cannabis. So the fact of the matter is it remains in the person's system for 28 days. So even though the doctor said, oh, this person does it at nighttime, it's only affecting them for 4 hours, there's no way to prove that. And so that becomes intensely problematic as well. And it becomes a sort of, there's no breathalyzer yet for cannabis intoxication.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of things you said. So one of the sort of themes that emerged here is about whether or not this legislation will help or hurt already marginalized populations. So as a legislator, is that something that concerns you, and is there something that you think might be done to sort of mitigate some of those effects?
I've got to tell you, the savings is going to happen for the justice system, if we look at this system-wide, will be quite massive, because there won't be people in front of the legal system for basically what amount to what will be ridiculous charges. Now, StatScan tells us 2016, there were 55,000 cannabis-related charges, and 76 of those were for simple possession only. Now, that was after Trudeau had made the announcement that legalization was going to happen, and yet people were still being prosecuted. Those are people whose lives have changed forever. It's an utter disgrace. Why? I understand that we hadn't crossed the bridge, we hadn't crossed the Rubicon or whatever, and the legislation had not yet come into effect, but why were people still being penalized? In California, where it is legal, they actually removed the crime of possession, and they did so retroactively, which I think is brilliant, because that way they expunged people's records. They were now released of that, because again, it comes back to that whole, it affects your entire future. It changes you as a person to know that you've been convicted with a criminal offense. And then for marginalized people, I mean, the facts and figures are absolutely nothing short of disgusting.
Okay, so just we wanted to just inform the students, just picking up on this famous ventilation system, that I believe, according to the legislative suggestion on the government's website, that college residences are a place where marijuana consumption is not permitted. So just so you know that. At least that's what I saw this morning, and I maybe changed. So we're coming sort of to the end here. Maybe we could just sort of, I have myself a lot of questions. Maybe I just want to sort of ask a little bit about, one thing is, there are different vehicles through which you can consume cannabis. So we talked about edibles, smoking, all these kind of things. Are some more or less safe than others to use? That's my first question I would like people to answer. But second is operation of a motor vehicle. So you talked about are there roadside tests for cannabis use and so on. Maybe we could sort of end by answering some of those two kind of broad questions. Those are kind of maybe practically useful for people, but raise sort of broader issues.
I can speak to modes of ingestion at this point. Currently, as the system exists now, there's really two main options. One is inhaling cannabis from the use of dried flowers, so whether that be using a vaporizer or smoking.
Which you didn't do.
And then there's...
I just didn't inhale, but yeah.
And then there's edible forms. And the edible form typically, depending on the licensed producer, is available in an oil that you basically put in your mouth and you swallow, or some producers have been approved to package it in the form of a gel cap or a capsule. I think you're going to start seeing more options become available. Topical, from a medical standpoint, topical creams, meter dose delivery systems, sprays, transdermal patches. So speaking of the medical, there's certainly lots of innovation going on in the industry. Recreational, as it stands now, no edibles allowed. I don't think there's been any formal sort of discussions around when that may be coming. If it's coming, I don't think that's been finalized. The issues around driving are really tricky. Cannabis as a substance does not lend itself well to monitoring for impairment. We know that with alcohol, there's a number of studies that show definitively that if your blood alcohol level is above a certain level, 0.08, it equates well to impairment. Cannabis doesn't have a comparable level that's a reliable predictor or indicator of impairment. The unfortunate reality is that the legislation as it currently exists is still going to be using, at least as part of their judgment process regarding impairment, that blood level per se limit. And it's faulty. The Canadian Chief of Police Association has come out right and told the federal government that they don't believe it's a reasonable indicator. There can be cannabis naive patients who can consume small quantities of cannabis that would never exceed that level and be obviously impaired. And on the flip side, you can get chronic cannabis users who use it on a daily basis, whose blood level is above that per se limit, and it's clearly not evidence of any impairment. And so it's a substance that, at least currently, as the science exists, does not lend itself well to a good sort of clinical test for impairment. And I don't know how the justice system is going to sort of adjudicate that. It's going to be really tricky. It makes my job as a physician who's prescribing cannabis medicines to patients very difficult. They need to be informed of the risk. that if you were stopped, if you're pulled on the side of the road, even though you don't feel impaired, you would still be at risk. If all dead and you have your blood level checked, there could be issues.
A little bit of a pharmacology lesson. So there's what's called a reverse hysteresis effect with, and I think I should draw it so you can see it. So if you have on the y-axis blood THC concentration, THC being the active psychoactive component of cannabis smoke, and on the x-axis being what's called the visual analog scale, is how, if you ask somebody on a line, draw a line for how high you are, and you would, depending on how high you are, you could either draw the line or not. But what you see is as this, so this is increasing. So here's 0. Here's 100 nanograms per mil, for example. What you see is a graph that looks like this. It's called the reverse hysteresis effect, that even if the blood levels are high, you can have a certain level of high, but even when they drop back down closer to 0, you still see a high in the blood levels. So there is really no way of doing a roadside test, even if you did manage to take blood from somebody, that would help you get a good indication of how impaired they are, and that's not considering the tolerance aspect that's pretty big when it comes to cannabis, where you can, as a seasoned user, could get away with a lot more than somebody who is drug naive.
I'm not going to get up and draw anything. Yeah, I totally agree on the driving impairment. It's really because of the metabolism of THC is very rapid. So you could have smoked THC or been exposed to it like an hour ago and then be fine, but there'll still be metabolites in your system. There are inactive metabolites and active metabolite. It's a mess. It's really very hard to measure. So we really have no good. Just to the point of I totally agree with the whole discussion around decriminalisation and the fact that people have criminal records for kind of ridiculously small misdemeanours and all the inequity in that. I'm completely on board with that. But just because this is a kind of a debate and a discussion of things that might happen or may have happened. So, and it's also to the point of different routes of administration and so on. So there are concerns about edibles because edibles can be a very high concentration of THC. Because of the way the exposure and the route of administration, people can be exposed to an edible and it can take an hour or a couple of hours before they feel an effect, and then they can feel this very acute high, which can cause acute psychosis. Now that may be relatively rare, but in a cannabis, but also to the point of the pharmacology of tolerance. So if you're cannabis naive, you may inadvertently be exposed to an edible that you just kind of someone else gives you, or that someone's bought legally, and then harm may come. Some harm may come to you because of that, whether it's induced by an acute psychosis that causes some kind of effect. So it's an interesting, also concerning legal discussion around if something's legal and you're exposed to that. You didn't know that was going to happen, or the risk wasn't written on the packet, or whatever, and some harm comes to you. Then that's the kind of thing that either the person who's been harmed or their family members may actually say, well, this isn't just a minor misdemeanor. It's an important harm. So it's just something else that we need to consider around people being exposed to very strong, potentially harmful levels of THC. Who is legally responsible for that situation? And we don't have anyone from law here, and I'm not a lawyer, but it's something I certainly have thought about. What will we do in those situations? And they will happen.
So maybe I started with you, Terence, so you can have the last word on these two
Okay. Now, this is not based on any first-hand knowledge of my own, but I've heard from quite a number of people who've been going across the border recently into the United States, and some of the questions that they're asking now that legalization is on the horizon is that, you know, have you used THC in the past 24 hours, etc.? Have you ever? And quite frankly, it's rather disturbing because there is some suggestion that if you answer that you have used it at any point in your life, then you could be barred admittance into the United States, which is kind of frightening. You know, if we take a look at, I think it's also important that we take a look at alcohol versus cannabis. And there's something problematic with the LCBO, and I'm all in favor of publicly owned things. I think privatization is absolutely the ruin of our society. It's the destruction of quality control, good jobs, etc. However, there's this interesting moral and legal and ethical problem with the state selling alcohol for profit. You know, the LCBO does rake in $2.06 billion a year, which does go into our hospitals and goes into our healthcare, and it goes into all the things that we rely on in our services. And in some ways, you know, there are people who have some very serious issues with that. I do think it would be much better if we had a publicly owned cannabis system as well. But if we take those two things and we compare them, you know, apples to oranges or whatever, you know, people can get drunk and really become quite dangerous. And there are many who in the cannabis community who say, well, if you consume too much, you'll fall asleep. That is obviously not the case for edibles and shattered glass, but I think it's one of those situations where, you know, with anything, too much of a good thing is bad.
Okay, so thanks so much to all of our great esteemed panelists. So maybe what we'll do now is we'll thank them all, and then we will have some time for questions from the audience. So. Do you want to take a microphone and yeah, that sounds good. Okay. So and please, in the interest of fairness, try to keep your question as concise as it can be, so that we have time for as many questions as we can.
For those that would like to ask questions, can hopefully it's not everybody, but can you maybe line up along the sides here so we know who to come to and there's an order? Just I can walk over there now on either side. I'm going to come over there on that side for the mic, and then we'll alternate like that. So if you want to ask a question, you can line up on this side and that side, and then we'll alternate.
Sorry.
So, some people can come this side.
Don't be afraid to go on this side.
Yeah. If it's okay, can I ask the question? Maybe not. Maybe I'll ask that. So,
yeah, we'll have an audience member. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, guys can quietly come to each side. We'll start on that side, and then we'll go this side, and we'll alternate like that, okay? Go for it.
Again, on the legal situation, we just went through federally a big compensation on the residential schools where the government gave billions of dollars away. Now, the panel's pretty well indicated the government was very incompetent in setting up the legislation for the cannabis. And since we know that there's more than 200 different genetic types of it with different strains, it's sort of like saying with alcohol, we got in the supermarkets 0.05 for non-alcoholic beverage, and you can then have overproof alcohol. Now, if you hand somebody a plant that somebody grew at home, not from the pharmaceutical industry, but from at home, which genetics do you have in that plant? How much are you getting? Now, if the government is that incompetent, are we going to set up where all these young people in the future, as taxpayers, are going to face one hell of a common law lawsuit against the federal and the provincial governments for incompetence, and for all these people that are underage or under 19 to 25 or even younger who have mental illness problems? Because I can see a class action thing being one hell of a thing of billions and billions of dollars down the line because the legislation is not in place.
Okay, great question. So let's, who wants to chime in this one? So the question is really about, look, since we don't have a lot of evidence about the negative effects, there might be
we do
some.
have the evidence of negative effects, especially for the young people, and there's going to be one heck of a liability situation of mental illness that's coming, and the medical field has demonstrated it exists.
Okay.
Again, I'm not talking from a legal perspective, but certainly I would be pretty concerned that in a number of years' time there will be this situation where we will look back at this point in time and look at the data we had and the way this process was incredibly rushed, and we will potentially, there will be people who are seeking legal advice in terms of why that happened and why they weren't in receipt of really solid public health information before they were exposed to that risk that potentially harmed them. So I think that may well happen.
It's a very good point.
Question. A lot of conjecture, obviously. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I should even comment. I don't have the legal background to comment adequately. I do think there are, just in general in society, we expose ourselves to risks every day. All I can speak to is my medical experience with patients, and we do spend a fair amount of time discussing with them the potential known risks. I also am explicit in that I do advise them that there are potentially some unknown risks. We don't have a great amount of data regarding the use of medical cannabis over a sustained period of time. And I think that's, as a physician, that's sort of all we can do. We can certainly do the same thing with conventional drugs as well. Some drugs we do a better job of than others. Yeah, I mean, there is potential for unknown risk down the line. But I think, I try and put it in the hands of my patients to try and make as informed a decision as possible at the time.
Okay, good. So we'll go over here.
So we know that there are certain tissues and certain organelles as well that have specific cannabinoid receptors on them. For example, the mitochondria even has a cannabinoid receptor on it. And we study the mitochondria in our lab, and when I sit down and think about it, why would an organelle that produces energy have a specific receptor for cannabinoids? So my question is that, is there a reason why these tissues and organelles have evolutionarily preserved these receptors within them? Do we have any evidence of humans in the past using cannabis for any kind of use at all?
Great.
I can speak to the historical aspect. I mean, the earliest recorded example of use of cannabis is about 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC in China. And really every major human civilization since then has recorded evidence of its use.
But speaking from an evolutionary perspective, it's beyond just cannabis, right? There's a whole system in your brain called the endocannabinoid neurotransmission system, where there are compounds within the brain that act on the exact same receptors that at least THC, CBD, who knows where it acts, but can act on within the brain. So there is very good reason that those are there wherever they are, because there's a whole system that does a great job of keeping all of your other neurotransmitter systems in check. And it's that's the best way that I can describe the endocannabinoid system. It's not great at any one thing, but it's sort of like the hall pass monitor for the brain.
It's also important to note that, it's also important to note that it has been used as a traditional medicine in indigenous cultures in Canada for hundreds and thousands of years.
Okay. Over here now, thank you.
Thanks. So I'm understanding that the edibles will be a year later, right? So I'm curious, once we're past that year later and maybe a couple of years, will that distinction between what's recreational cannabis and medical cannabis, will that perpetuate, will that continue? Because I imagine if you can get access to the type of cannabis with the type of percentage that you're seeking, why would you bother going through a physician for a prescription if you don't need to? And that's why I'm wondering if the whole distinction of medical cannabis might just disappear after about 5-10 years.
So my understanding is under the current proposal, they are treated differently under different regulations. Is that the case?
The medical system is sort of operating under the MMPAR regulatory system. I think there's sort of two parts to your question. The one part of the question revolves around sort of the system under which it operates, and there's a lot of debate over, once cannabis is available through a legal adult use market, is there any need for a medical system? In fact, the Canadian Medical Association has come out and said, we don't think there should be. We don't think our members should be involved in any capacity in the delivery of cannabis to patients. I'm sort of philosophically, I'm sort of opposed to that stance, and I can get into it if you like. The other part of the question is there a difference between medical cannabis and recreational cannabis? And the answer to that is no. The difference lies in the motivation of the user. So a recreational user could get some medical cannabis, whatever that is, at high potency THC and get high. There's nothing to stop them from doing so. In fact, the products that are produced by medical cannabis licensed producers are exact same products as what are going to be available in the Ontario Cannabis Store. So there is no difference. Now there's certainly, in a sort of a medical market, there's going to be more of a sort of consumer-driven desire for a more broad spectrum of cannabis products with different ratios of THC and CBD for obvious reasons. Whereas the recreational consumer is likely going to have more of an emphasis on a higher THC strain so they can feel that euphoria. But there is no difference between medical and recreational cannabis.
One of the situations that's happened is a number of companies, licensed producers that were medical cannabis companies, are now going into the recreational market, so there's no distinction in the product. I think back to the kind of endocannabinoid system, it's really important to know that if you have an imbalance in a system, using a medication has a really different effect. Using something has a really different effect from in a healthy system. So it's really important not to blur the lines between medical use and recreational use in terms of our science. And one of the problems is that because now cannabis will be so available for recreation under this recreational kind of banner, it kind of takes the onus off medical companies to do that really rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials that are really expensive to do, because they no longer really need to, because people can just buy this legally without any really good data. So it's really detracted from solid data for patients who find benefits from this, because now it's a kind of free-for-all on who's going to spend the money on getting that rigorous data.
Yeah, maybe I should jump in and sort of follow up on that. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm in support of the medical system. It's going to continue to drive the research forward. So we do learn more about cannabis, its effects and its harms. Number two, a lot of these patients are deriving benefit on an anecdotal basis for sure, but one of the big barriers to access for them is cost. We're in an early stage of the process now where we're starting to see third-party insurance companies start to come on board and cover the cost of these products for them. And I think once that medical system is removed, that's a non-starter, it's done. And those barriers will continue to be a problem for these patients. And the third thing was sort of what I touched on, in that with the medical system, I think you're going to see more of sort of continued emphasis on the development of products with therapeutic benefit in mind, as opposed to strictly sort of refining the product stream to only cater to the recreational user.
Do you want to quickly say, yeah? Okay, so yeah, we'll over here now, yeah. Sorry, I think to be so heavy-handed, but we want to get it quick.
So in things like alcohol, we've been able to identify critical periods where even one-time use, like in pregnancy, has pretty serious negative consequences. I started to see more studies kind of in this adolescent, young adult period where one-time use is being even seen as quite dangerous. So I'm just curious as kind of your opinion on the state of this even one-time, first-time user in this critical period.
I think that there's the one-time user in the critical period issue, and there's also the one-time user in any period. So we don't have lots of data yet, but it's a really important point because we're focusing a lot on youth, and there's a really major question around first-time users, people with risks, and young adults, say 18 to 25, whatever. So there's some data out there. I think Jibran might be aware of the one-time use data, but there really isn't. There's not a vast amount of information, but there's certainly concerns around one-time use triggering an acute psychosis that then leads to a long-term schizophrenia type illness, for example. So one-time use in pregnancy may be another one that could be a major problem. So
I was trying to quickly Google this because I remember seeing a paper related to one-time exposure resulting in somewhat long-lasting changes in brain architecture. So there is some data out there. I just can't remember it right now. Maybe I should have looked it up earlier today. But that it was a DTI-based tractography study where you can assess the architecture of the brain and how white matter connects one part of the region with another, and there was one-time use had some appreciable differences there, so you just can't remember exactly what those were.
Okay, so we'll go over here.
So, Jonas, you already spoke to this a little bit earlier, but in Canada we have some of the highest rates of cannabis use with youth within the entire world. And there's obviously lots of mental health issues with the use of people under 25 or developing brain. But with the current legislation as it's proposed, children aged 12 to 18 will be allowed to have up to 5 grams of cannabis on them in possession and be legally allowed to possess it. How they're going to get that, I don't know. How do they get it right now, right? But there have been prominent lawyers that have spoken about this, John Bryce, and other individuals as well. But I'm curious, as the entire purpose of the legalization within Canada, as Justin Trudeau mentioned, was to reduce access for youth. I'm curious what your thoughts are about this and if it actually accomplishes the goals, and if not, open up the entire panel, but if not, then what might be the best way to go about handling this?
It's my understanding that you will only be able to purchase and acquire cannabis legally at the age of 19. I don't think that there ought to be any legislation that is covering 12 to 18 because, generally speaking, that's your biggest formative years. I think that should be sort of prohibited. I think we have to be careful with youth. I don't think when we take a look at the science and developing brands, I think that's something we have to be very, very careful of.
Are you referring to access to medical cannabis?
No, recreational.
Recreational.
I think the purpose of having that filter, or having that within the legislation, within the paperwork, is to prevent people under the age of 19 being punished, legally, and having everything that people still pursue long-term detriments to their employment and all these things. So it is within the legislation. I'm not sure if the full government within Ontario has specifically changed that or not, but
I'm not aware. I mean, the legislation says now 19 is the youngest you can be to purchase it legally.
To purchase, but not necessarily. You're saying
your possession? Yeah, I don't know anything about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll go over here.
So one of the great motivators of individuals to stop smoking tobacco, for example, is the effect of secondhand smoking. So has any work been done with marijuana to show effects of secondhand smoking?
Not as much. There are now, so if you go to the International Cannabinoid Research Society or the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, now you're beginning to see posters and talks. So it's just not out in the world yet, and that's something that's happening more. But as far as cancer risk, it's not and I'm going to be really careful how I say this, the combustion forms of cannabis are bad for you compared to others that are less harmful. But because some of the tobacco-specific nicosamines that are found in tobacco are not present in the cannabis plant, that risk might not be as great, but we honestly don't know yet. And we don't know not just about the cannabis plant, but even when you have these e-juices that you're finding in e-cigarettes, you don't know what the long-term consequences of any of those are. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. We just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. We just don't know. There are a few studies that have been done where put a bunch of people in the room and smoke a bunch of cannabis, and indications would be you'd have to be exposed to a large amount of cannabis spoke to experiencing the intoxication over a long period of time. Practically speaking, it isn't going to happen. But in terms of the risk related to cancer, we just don't know. And what makes cannabis sort of a really interesting substance is that there is some indication, at least preclinically in animal models, test tubes, that it may actually have some anti-neoplastic properties as well. So how do you fit that into the big picture? We don't know. We just don't know, and that just, again, emphasizes the need for further research.
Okay.
If I can go back to one of the previous questions about the critical period, I just want to say that there has been some studies from the 70s that high amounts of THC in crude marijuana extract has caused neural tube defects in animals, which have been lethal, but there hasn't been much follow-up research into that because it was such a high amount, which now maybe there should be. But my question, which I'm really looking to answer from everybody, was has there been any consideration in the policies as well as how medically and scientifically, if this is even going to be helpful, because we're allowing people to do something that's never been done before. We're allowing them really to self-medicate. And not just that, we're allowing them to choose how they want to make their marijuana. They can make it themselves. We're not going to really have much data on how much THC, how much CBD, and all the other chemicals are in there, like what proportions, which is really important scientifically. So has there been any policy considerations about why we're letting people do that? As well as how do you think that's going to help us scientifically and medically going forward?
I think in terms of is it going to be helpful, it's obviously a huge question, and it depends on who you're talking about in terms of being helpful. But we've talked about the decriminalisation aspect in terms of it's helpful in that aspect of criminalisation of inequities and so on, which isn't my area of expertise. But in terms of being helpful,
Like in research.
yeah, well, people often use the word social experiment, and that something about that really kind of upsets me in a sense. The fact that we're doing an experiment on such a large scale, and it's been for all the reasons we've outlined, doing these kind of experiments kind of. Using that word even kind of concerns me a little bit. So it could be helpful in terms of gathering data, because as Jibran pointed out, people didn't always, they couldn't, there was this secrecy, so you didn't know who was doing what, so you couldn't gather the data. But as I outlined, my concern is this combination of for-profit marketing and promotion, which we're all very aware historically of the risks of that, and how that combines with a public health message, and whether that whole scenario will actually be a barrier to what could have been a helpful process may in fact be undermined. So that's one of my major concerns.
Okay, does anyone want to add to that? Or?
The only point I touch on a little bit is the misnomer of self-medication. And so, everybody, and this is partly because of how we view things like mental illnesses, for example. Whenever I do a talk, I often poll the audience to figure out, why do you think people with schizophrenia use drugs? And the only answer I get is self-medication. The problem is that you can't really self-medicate things, and even if you look at the evidence of it, most of these people are not actually self-medicating, because there's no correlation between symptom severity and how much they use. They were already using way before the symptoms ever came up, And if they are to quit or get off of their drugs, they actually get better. And the last one, for most mental illnesses, the problem is treatment non-compliance. They don't take their usual drugs that have been proven to help. Why would they take something that's not proven? So we need to be careful as well about how we talk about self-medication, because the more you talk about something, the more people begin to believe it, right? And so we need to sort of dust off some of that self-medication dogma that people have, is what is being medicated and whether it's actually medicating something or not, or whether it's just hurting them. And that's where it'll be really interesting. And I'm not doubting the potential medicinal benefits of it, but let a doctor help you with that instead of deciding it for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is whether or not, people under an era of prohibition in using cannabis are truly effectively self-medicating is a completely different story as to compared to are they trying to effectively self-medicate. And the reality is they are. They're trying to self-medicate. And so with a system like this in place, is it going to be a system which allows them to do so in perhaps a safer manner? With, again, less contaminants, less pesticides, less herbicides, not involving a black market system, less risk of incarceration, less risk of police involvement and legal implications. So I think you have to take into account the entire context when we talk about self-medication. As to the implied opportunity, I think for sure the number of observational trials is going to increase. The question is that valuable? We have a ton of observational data as it pertains to cannabis use. We need more than that, and we need to be pushing for more than that. We need those placebo-controlled, randomized trials.
So earlier you guys were talking about how there's no reliable way to measure if someone's too impaired to be driving if they've been using cannabis. And you were mentioning the objective measure of blood alcohol level that's already being used now. And I was wondering, has there been any discussion about some type of behavioral or cognitive testing that people could use to measure how high someone is?
So, I mean, there are drug recognition experts on every police force that uses a sort of clinical test to try and determine intoxication. The blood test that we're referring to is just sort of one facet of that test. So typically, if they expect impairment at the roadside, they will likely bring you into the station where you will meet with a fully trained professional drug recognition expert, in which that testing process is much more involved. And as part of that, you will also be given a sample, whether it be a saliva sample, whether it be a blood sample. So it is a more involved process.
Yeah, okay, over here.
Hi. I really appreciate you guys coming out and sharing your experiences with us. What I hear a lot, and I'm okay, from where you stand, I understand that there's a lot of hesitation, there's a lot of, not fear, but definitely wanting to be careful about how this is implemented in Canada, wanting to make sure that as a population we're okay. So my question is, what is the incentive for a researcher to study cannabis in ways that can answer some of these things that we say we don't know? So for example, what would be the actual level that might be an impairment for somebody? What is the difference between a 40-year-old black female versus a 35-year-old white male taking various levels of THC? What's going to be the incentive for researchers in this country to take a look at these things and actually find some answers so that medical professionals and policymakers can do something that's really helpful for all of us?
Great question.
I would imagine that the government will need that data in order to enact correct legislation that will protect communities. So I think there will be, in addition to the number of jobs that are being created by the cannabis industry, that will be certainly an offshoot of it. So I think that your point is very valid. It does raise the question, though, where will that magic borderline be, and will that just be something that's completely arbitrary? It's hard to say.
So for a lot of us, it remains what our motivation is for doing research in general, to study things that are relevant to the general public and to advance our knowledge. And that's why some of us, at least here, have actually avoided calls from licensed producers or who want to fund this research, but to sort of maintain that arm's length distance and that conflict of interest, so that we're not, necessarily doing the research that only benefits them or are limited in our ability to disclose or disseminate our findings. But at the basic level, it's the same motivation that got us into research, is to answer questions that are relevant to the public and that are medically relevant in terms of public health, relevant in terms of public policy, and to inform the discussion that's happening. That's what academia and the purpose of it is for.
Yeah, it's a great question, and as Jibran says, that's what I've been working on this for 25 years, when everyone thought it was a boring topic. So we're kind of motivated by knowledge generation, but we're funded by government agencies who are earmarking some funding for cannabinoid research, which is great. That means we've hopefully got funding for that. I would have loved to have seen some kind of top slicing of any profits. Being mandatory, going straight into research. So I would have liked to see some kind of tax on the cannabis companies that had to be spent on research. And we need a lot of funding to actually carry out clinical trials. It's really expensive. But it's a great question. So.
Okay, so we do have a little bit of time left, but not much. So please try to be brief on the last few questions.
What are the merits of the argument that legalizing marijuana will lead to the legalization of other recreational hallucinogens, such as LSD or psilocybin in the future? Is it perhaps inevitable, considering they may have comparable benefits for people?
Sorry, can I add to that? So next year, our psilocybin discussion. So psilocybin legalization discussion. What's going to be the topics for that? That's an excellent question.
I guess, in order to answer that from just a general perspective, it depends on how this experiment goes. And I know we hate to say that, our lives and our livelihoods and our society should not be an experiment, but it depends on how people will behave. How will people treat it? Will there be reefer madness? It's, hard to say. We know in Portugal, they have decriminalized everything. And people have responded. They expected it to be a great social turmoil, and yet there wasn't. It began to allow the state to deal with addiction properly by removing that taboo. So there is some thought. Whether that would work here entirely or not, that's not for me to say.
I'm hoping that we decriminalize opioids before we go to psilocybin and hallucinogens. But that's just me because of the big problem that we have in terms of the epidemic. And we're doing everything in our power to not deal with the problem and to do away with safe injection sites or things of that sort. And so at least decriminalization in that case, I'm not asking for legalization, would help people seek help or not have somebody die in the bathroom of McDonald's because of an overdose and because we don't have Narcan available, people are, even the Good Samaritan law associated with it, people will call the cops or the paramedics and then run away, and nobody's there watching a person while they're ODing. So that's a more serious, immediate concern that's there. So I'm hoping that it leads to some thought, at least, about policies, but maybe not full legalization of everything, because if we don't have data on cannabis, we definitely don't have data on hallucinogens, and except for the culture in corporate world where microdosing is the fad with LSD and psilocybin, but we really don't have data. So we need data, and decriminalization can potentially help because people will be more willing to report, but we should also not take from this whole legalization thing and go jump into legalization without much thought.
Yeah, I would like to start with seeing what the effect of cannabis legalization has on opioid mortality, opioid overdose deaths, opioid total dose reduction, prescription reduction. We've seen it happen in other jurisdictions. We'll see what happens in the Canadian experience.
Okay. I think we've got time for two more. Sorry. We're coming up against the time here.
First of all, the types of like your research subjects, are they mostly animal or are they human?
usually I'm working on kind of the pharmacology of THC and CBD. So usually we're trying to identify the molecular targets. So we're using cellular systems and for CBD we're trying to work out what's its molecular target. So it's kind of molecular biology, cell cultures, we use neuronal cells. So those kind of models. So I'm not working in, it's all preclinical, so I'm not working in human. So any of the things we've talked about in terms of epidemiology is just our kind of knowledge of the literature and so on.
But the neuronal cells, like where are they coming from?
They're often what we call immortalized cell lines. So these are cell lines that we have in the lab that are very similar to, they may be actually human derived. Tumor cell derived cells and so on. So there's various models we would use and platforms in my particular research.
Okay, so
I have worked both with animal models and with brain imaging studies in patients with schizophrenia and cannabis use disorder, for example, and now we're also transitioning to what's called a cerebral organoid base. So where we're taking cells from patients who have either schizophrenia or controls and growing these little brains in a dish that then we can also test the effects of. And these are coming from patients and humans. So in addition to the animal work that we're doing, and that the real reason for trying to skirt both lines of what's called the translational spectrum is because while we can get beautiful association and associative data from humans, we can't get a causality, and that's why we need to reverse translate some of that back into animal models so we can really test out whether this hypothesis that we came up with in the human condition really is causal or is just an association that has come up. And the schizophrenia and cannabis use is one of those questions that really needs addressing from both sides of the coin.
Totally. So that brings me back to the age of majority being 19. With that being said, higher level, your cortical development finishes at 25 plus or minus. What are the neuropharmacological implications of that? And like what can happen?
Cannabis use between those ages, you mean, or
before 25?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's all to do with developmental brain patterning and so on. So neuronal, how your brain kind of forms connections that become embedded and permanent after development stops. So there's lots of changes still happening to how the brain is actually where connections are made and whether those become embedded or whether there's still plasticity there. And those kinds of things are very much ongoing in the developmental period. And so these are the kind of questions we're at. And because the key thing is the endocannabinoid system is a really key player in brain development. Mm-hmm. And so if you start interfering with a key player, then you may then interfere with how that whole system ends up being kind of embedded in adulthood. And of course there are very much kind of, there are sex differences there. There isn't an absolute age when you can say, okay, it's stopped today, you're safe, or that's biology. It's not an exact science in that sense.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add is at Western you actually have an expert, Steve Laviolette, who has studied a lot of this, and so I would suggest you send him an email, go talk to him, read some of his papers. He's done some wonderful work related to this, and this Friday I believe you have another expert who's actually been knighted, Sir Robin Murray, also giving a talk related to this Friday morning. So I would suggest for those of you interested, go out and seek sources from or these experts and their thoughts on this, because there's lots of them here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Great. So one final question.
So good. So considering that cannabis may be currently available in First Nation communities, how will cannabis legalization in a for-profit system affect Indigenous communities and Indigenous health in Canada?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I mean, it already is available, so I think we need to sort of realize that. I think the system as it sort of develops, I think the response to that system is likely going to be dictated to a large extent by market forces and by prices. So, I mean, I'm not an economist by any stretch, so again, I like to stay in my lane, but you know, there's a lot of concern within the cannabis community that with a for-profit system, margins, in order to remain high for the producers, may put it out of reach cost-wise from clients. We've got a excise tax that the federal government is putting both on medical and recreational cannabis, which is another barrier. And so I wonder whether some of these patients, because of those barriers, are going to navigate and sort of find their way to the legal system, or whether they're going to continue to access it through a black market source.
Yes, it's really all linked in with, as you said, this for-profit system, because the problem, and also this not a clear demarcation between a recreational and medicinal, where you've got this lack of imperative now for medicinal to actually get really good evidence and a good system and good data and access. So that whole kind of drive to do that has now kind of evaporated because of the whole recreational for-profit model, which inevitably, with these kinds of models, there are certain groups of people who often suffer more harms than other groups just because of the way the whole thing's set up. So, so that's a major concern.
Yeah, I was reading some articles recently about legal enforcement of cannabis on reservations, and you would think that our federal government would be more concerned with getting clean water to places like that rather than taking away something that is cultural. You know, and I also think that there should be, with legislation in place, there should be certain respect given to First Nations communities and making sure that, you know, their culture and there should be a dialogue, and their culture should be respected. It's something that has been used for, as we've said, you know, hundreds and thousands of years. I don't understand how the same rules should apply, because they shouldn't.
What I'm currently concerned about is the current cannabis dispensaries that may exist in First Nations. If those are going to be shut down by the federal government, or would they still be accessible?
Given the legislation that's in place now, it looks as though they're trying to shut down all of those dispensaries. And all of the major growers right now are only going to be allowed one bricks and mortar location each. So this legislative change is a way to sort of put out of business these people who are in that sort of gray area, you know, saying, you know, please come here, we'll give you a medical diagnosis for whatever you want, and then you can cannabis. So it's, you know, but within that as well, there's also problems, because even though those people have, as we said, operated in that gray area, they also understand the market, they understand what is necessary, and they could actually help with the way this is rolled out properly. So again, I'd go back to the gray area.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap our event up. That's the way the cookie crumbles.
I just want to say one last point.
Okay.
Okay, I just want to say thank you very much for everyone for showing up. You know, it's always hard to put on an event and know how many people are going to come. So everyone who registered and came, and everyone who didn't register and came, excellent. Thank you very much for coming. You guys basically made it, because otherwise we'd be speaking to nobody. So thanks again for the panelists. We thank them for the question period, but I also want to say that it took a lot of effort on Anthony's part to do the moderating. So that was a lot of work, and he made it really good for us. So let's finish by thanking Anthony and Vanderzwan. Thanks everyone for coming. We hope to put on more of these events, so look out for our ads. Thanks.